Tupac was visiting sick kids at Children's Hospital when a dying old man grabbed his arm and whispered 6 words that would haunt him forever. What this stranger knew about his father would shatter everything Tupac believed about his family, his identity, and his entire life. It was December 12, 1995, and Tupac Shakur was doing something the media rarely covered, quietly visiting terminally ill children at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. No cameras, no publicity, no record label executives trying to turn charity into a photo opportunity. Just in bringing joy to kids who were fighting battles far tougher than anything he'd ever faced in the streets. This had become Tupac's secret ritual, something that grounded him when the pressures of fame threatened to consume his soul. Every few weeks, he'd slip away from his busy schedule, dodging interviews, studio sessions, and business meetings, to spend hours with children whose bodies were failing them but whose spirits remained unbreakable. The hospital staff had learned to keep his visits completely private, understanding that this wasn't about image management or charity write-offs for tax purposes. This was about a man trying to give back to the most vulnerable members of society, trying to find meaning in his success by sharing hope with those who needed it most. But nobody in that hospital could have predicted that in exactly 47 minutes, one dying man's confession would destroy everything Tupac thought he knew about himself. The visit had started like all the others, with Tupac checking in quietly at the nurse's station and being escorted through hallways that smelled of disinfectant and held the muffled sounds of machines keeping people alive. He'd learned to prepare himself emotionally for these visits, knowing that he'd encounter children facing mortality with more grace than most adults ever managed. Today's rounds took him through the pediatric cancer ward, where he moved from room to room like a gentle giant, his usual tough exterior completely melted away by the innocence and courage of his young patients. He'd sit cross-legged on hospital beds and listen to 8-year-olds explain chemotherapy with the matter-of-fact wisdom of little adults who'd been forced to grow up too fast. In room 312, he met 9-year-old David Chen, a boy with brain cancer who had memorized every word of Dear Mama and performed it with such emotion that Tupac had to excuse himself to cry in the hallway. David's mother, a single immigrant woman working 3 jobs to pay medical bills, thanked Tupac through her own tears for making her son smile for the first time in weeks. He writes his own songs now, she whispered to Tupac, about being brave, about helping other kids who are scared. You inspired him to turn his pain into art. Those words hit Tupac deeply. This was why he made music, not for the charts or the money, but to help people transform their suffering into something meaningful. In room 314, he met 7-year-old Maria Santos, a little girl with leukemia, whose spirit was so bright, it seemed to illuminate the entire room despite her bald head and pale skin from chemotherapy. She told him she wanted to be a rapper when she grew up and performed a song she'd written about being brave. Sometimes I feel scared and want to cry, she rapped in her small voice. But then I remember that warriors don't die, they just fly higher in the sky. The raw honesty and hope in her words moved Tupac to tears. Maria, that's the realest rap verse I've heard in years. You got more heart than grown men I know. You really mean that? Maria asked, her eyes bright with hope despite everything she was going through. I promise you, Tupac said, taking her small hand in his. Warriors like you deserve to have their voices heard. When you get better, we're going to record that song properly. It was moments like these that reminded Tupac why his fame could be a blessing rather than a curse. Why his painful childhood might serve a purpose if he could help other kids feel less alone in their struggles. These children were fighting for their lives with more courage than most adults ever showed, and their strength humbled him every single time. As he left Maria's room and walked down the antiseptic corridor toward the pediatric cancer ward's common area, Tupac felt the familiar mixture of inspiration and heartbreak that these visits always brought. He was scheduled to spend another hour with the children, maybe play some guitar, tell stories about his travels, help them forget their pain for a little while. But as he passed the adult oncology wing on his way to the elevator, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of his entire life. Tupac, a weak voice called from one of the rooms. Tupac Shakur. Tupac stopped walking abruptly. Hospital staff had strict orders not to bother him during children's visits, and the adult patients weren't supposed to know he was even in the building. But something about the voice, desperate, urgent, like a man with very little time left and something crucial to say, made him pause in his tracks. "Tupac, please. I need to talk to you. It's about your father." Those 5 words, "it's about your father," hit Tupac like lightning, stopping his heart for a moment before it began racing. His father had been the greatest mystery and deepest pain of his entire life, the ghost that haunted every relationship, every song about family, every moment when he tried to understand who he really was. Growing up without knowing who his biological father was had shaped everything about him, his anger at absent men, his music about broken families, his desperate need to prove himself as a man worthy of respect and love. The question, "Who is my father?" had driven him to therapy, to countless sleepless nights, to a search for identity that music's success couldn't fill. Tupac looked around the hospital corridor nervously, making sure no security guards or staff members were watching, then walked slowly toward the voice that had just referenced his deepest wound. In room 507 lay a black man who appeared to be in his 70s, skeletal from cancer, his skin gray and stretched over prominent bones. Multiple machines surrounded his bed, oxygen, heart monitors, IV drips, all working to keep him alive a little longer. But his eyes were alert, intelligent, and when he saw Tupac enter the room, they filled with tears of relief. "Thank you for coming," the man whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with emotion. "My name is Thomas Jefferson Williams. I've been trying to find a way to reach you for months, ever since the doctors told me I only had weeks to live." Tupac approached the bed cautiously, every instinct telling him to be careful, but his desperate need for answers pulling him forward. "How do you know about my father? How do you even know who I am?" Thomas tried to sit up, wincing with pain that was clearly excruciating. "I've been following your career since the beginning, watching your interviews, reading about your search for identity, hearing the pain in your music about growing up without a father figure. And every time I thought about what I know, what I promised to keep secret until the right moment." "What secret?" Tupac asked, his voice barely steady. "Because I knew him," Thomas said, struggling to breathe between words. "I knew William Jefferson Garland personally. We were best friends for over 20 years, and there are things about him and about you that your mother never told you. Things that would explain why you felt so lost, so angry, so disconnected from your own story." The name William Jefferson Garland was like a dagger to Tupac's heart. This was the man listed as his father on his birth certificate, but Afeni Shakur had always been frustratingly vague about him. She'd told Tupac only that William had left when Tupac was very young, that she'd lost touch with him years ago, and that he hadn't been ready for the responsibility of being a father. "You knew my father personally?" Tupac asked, his voice cracking with emotion he'd been suppressing for years. "I didn't just know him," Thomas said, his eyes growing more intense despite his physical weakness. "I was his best friend from childhood, his brother in everything but blood. And I was there the night you were conceived. I was there through your mother's pregnancy. I was there when you were born. And I was there the night he made the decision that has haunted both of us for over 20 years. The room suddenly felt like it was spinning." Tupac grabbed the back of a hospital chair to steady himself, his knees weak from the emotional impact of hearing someone speak about his father as a real person rather than a mysterious absence. "Tell me everything," Tupac said, his voice a mixture of desperation and fear. "I need to know everything you know about him, about why he left, about who I really am." Thomas looked directly into Tupac's eyes with an intensity that was both comforting and terrifying. "Son, there's something you need to understand about that night, about your parents' relationship, about why your father really left. But before I tell you, you need to promise me that you won't hate your mother for keeping this secret." Tupac felt his chest tighten with anxiety. "What are you talking about?" Thomas closed his eyes as if the memory he was about to share was too painful to recall while looking at Tupac's face. Your mother told you that William left because he couldn't handle being a father, right? That he was irresponsible, immature, not ready for the commitment of raising a child? Tupac nodded, feeling tears he'd been holding back for years threatening to spill over. That's what she always said, that he just couldn't handle the responsibility. That's not what happened, Thomas said, his voice growing weaker but more urgent. William Jefferson Garland didn't leave because he didn't want to be your father. He left because someone told him that you weren't his son. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tupac felt all the blood drain from his face, felt his hands begin to shake uncontrollably. What do you mean? He whispered. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Tupac with a mixture of compassion and pain that made clear how difficult this revelation was for him to share. Your mother was heavily involved with the Black Panthers during the late 1960s and early 1970s, as you know. But what you don't know is that during the time she was with William, she was also involved romantically with another man. A man who was married, a man who held a prominent position in the revolutionary movement, a man who could acknowledge paternity publicly without destroying both his family and his standing in the organization. Tupac's legs gave out completely. He collapsed into the hospital chair, his mind racing to process what he was hearing. Are you saying my mother was cheating on William? I'm saying that your mother was in love with two men at the same time, Thomas corrected gently. William knew about the other relationship. They talked about it openly. William was prepared to raise you as his own son, regardless of biological paternity, because he loved your mother deeply and he'd already fallen in love with the idea of being your father. Thomas reached toward his knitstand with a shaking hand and pulled out a yellowed envelope with Tupac's name written on it in fading blue ink. But when you were 2 years old, someone I never found out who told William definitively that genetic testing had proven you were the other man's child. More importantly, they told him that your mother had been using him as a cover story to protect the real father's reputation and marriage. Tupac stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it, afraid of what other truths it might contain. So he left because he felt used? He left because he felt like he'd been living a lie, Thomas said sadly. Not because you weren't his biological son, he'd already accepted that possibility, but because he felt like your mother had deceived him about her true feelings, had used his love to cover up an affair that could have destroyed the movement if it became public knowledge. Thomas held out the envelope with a trembling hand. William was heartbroken. Not angry, heartbroken. He felt like he'd lost the woman he loved and the child he'd grown to adore. All because political necessity had required deception that he couldn't emotionally handle. So he just walked away from me? Tupac asked, the old anger and abandonment pain rising in his throat. He walked away from the situation that was breaking his heart every day. Thomas corrected, but not before giving me this letter and making me promise to find you when you were old enough to understand the complexity of what had happened. He wanted you to know that leaving wasn't about not loving you. It was about not being able to live with what he saw as fundamental dishonesty about the most important relationships in his life. Tupac took the envelope with trembling hands, but before opening it, he had to ask the question that was burning in his mind. Do you know who my real father is? Thomas nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a secret he'd been carrying for decades. William spent years after he left trying to find out definitively who your biological father was. Not to hurt anyone, but because he felt you had a right to know your true heritage. And 3 years before he died in 1989, he finally confirmed what he'd suspected all along. Tupac's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. Who was it? Thomas looked at him with eyes full of compassion and pain, clearly understanding how devastating this revelation would be. Your real father is Dr. Afeni Shakur. The name was like another lightning strike. Dr. Afeni Shakur, Afeni's second husband, the man who had adopted Tupac when he was young, the man Tupac had always called stepfather. The Black Panther leader who had been like a father figure to him before being imprisoned for revolutionary activities. Afeni Shakur is my biological father? Tupac asked, his voice cracking. That's what William believed. The timeline fits perfectly. Mutulu was married to another woman when he and your mother began their relationship, but they were deeply in love. When Afeni got pregnant, they knew that revealing the truth would cause a scandal in the movement, Thomas continued, each word hitting Tupac like a hammer blow. So they created the story about William being your father. William agreed to play the role because he loved your mother and because he believed in protecting the movement. But when you were 2, someone told him the truth, and he couldn't handle being part of the deception anymore. Tupac sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. Afeni Shakur, the man he'd idolized, the revolutionary hero he'd looked up to, the man he'd visited in prison and called his stepfather, was actually his biological father? Why didn't my mother ever tell me? Tupac asked. Because revealing the truth would have meant admitting that she de-used William Jefferson Garland as a cover story. It would have meant acknowledging that the movement's leaders weren't perfect, that they had human flaws and complicated relationships just like everyone else. Thomas reached for Tupac's hand with his own weak, dying grip. But William wanted you to know that he loved you, that leaving you was the hardest thing he ever did, and that you were wanted by him, by Mutulu, by your mother. You weren't an accident or a burden. You were the product of love, even if that love was complicated. Tupac opened the envelope with shaking hands and found a letter written in careful handwriting. Dear Tupac, if you're reading this, then Thomas found you like I asked him to. I want you to know that leaving you was not about you being bad or unwanted. You were the brightest light in my life for 2 years. I left because I couldn't be part of a lie anymore, but I regretted it every day until I died. You have your real father's intelligence and your mother's fire. Use them to change the world. With love, William Jefferson Garland. Tupac broke down crying in that hospital room. Years of pain and questions finally finding answers, but those answers creating entirely new wounds. Is there proof? He asked through his tears. Thomas nodded weakly. William kept everything. Documents, photos, letters between your mother and Mutulu from before you were born. It's all in a safety deposit box in Oakland. The key is taped under this hospital bed. Thomas was getting weaker, his breath more labored. I'm dying, son. Lung cancer. But I promised William I'd tell you the truth before I went. I've been following your career, waiting for the right moment. Why now? Tupac asked. Because you're becoming a father yourself someday, maybe. And you deserve to know your real heritage before you try to be the father you never had. Tupac spent the next 3 hours with Thomas, learning everything the dying man knew about William Jefferson Garland, about Afeni Shakur, about the complicated relationships that had shaped his early childhood. He learned that William had been a gifted writer who had encouraged Afeni's political awakening. He learned that Mutulu had written love letters to Afeni that showed a depth of emotion Tupac had never seen from his stepfather. When Thomas passed away 2 days later, Tupac was at his bedside. The dying man's last words were, "Tell William I kept my promise." Tupac retrieved the safety deposit box contents, which confirmed everything. Photos of Mutulu and Afeni together before Tupac was born. Love letters showing the timeline of their relationship, and documents William had collected. The revelation changed Tupac profoundly. He confronted Afeni, and after initial denial, she admitted Mutulu was indeed his biological father. She explained she'd kept the secret to protect everyone involved. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you were the product of deception, Afeni explained through tears. I wanted you to have a simple story, even if it meant you felt abandoned. Tupac's relationship with Mutulu also changed. During their next prison visit, Tupac confronted him with the truth. Mutulu broke down and admitted he'd suspected for years, but hadn't known how to handle it. I've watched you become the man I hoped you'd be, Mutulu said. Whether I was your stepfather or biological father didn't matter. I was proud of you either way. The experience fundamentally changed Tupac's music and relationships. Songs he wrote dealt with themes of hidden identity, complicated love, and how family secrets shape entire lives. He began reaching out to other children growing up without fathers, understanding that sometimes absence is more complicated than simple abandonment. 6 months after Thomas died, Tupac established a foundation for children in foster care and those who didn't know their biological parents. He understood that identity questions could haunt someone for life, and he wanted to help other young people find answers and support. The secret became the subject of Tupac's most introspective song, though he never explained publicly what inspired it. The lyrics dealt with family complexity, the weight of secrets, and how love can exist amid deception and abandonment. The story of Thomas Williams and his deathbed revelation reminds us that the most important truths sometimes come from unexpected sources, that family relationships are often more complicated than they appear, and that understanding our origins can be both devastating and healing. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that our identities are shaped by more than biology, and that the most important family members are often those who choose to love us regardless of genetics.